Welcome to the Selling to Corporate podcast, where we're going to be challenging your sales beliefs around selling to corporate organizations and help you increase your bottom line profits every single month. I am Jessica Lorimer, your sales expert and guide in this world of selling to corporate companies, skyrocketing your company sales and making the impact that you really want in the world. Now, don't forget, if you do enjoy the show today, please do head over to iTunes and leave us a review. But enjoy this episode, and I am really looking forward to sharing some epic sales wisdom with you. Well, I am so genuinely excited to have you here on the podcast. It is rare that I invite any other sales professionals onto it, but we've had some great conversations over the last few weeks, and I thought it would be nice to introduce you to the Selling to Corporate podcast audience. Welcome, Jason, to officially the Selling to Podcast show.
Well, Jessica, it's a pleasure to be here. It's fun to encounter someone cut from the same cloth in an industry where oftentimes you don't get to encounter the people that we want to look up to, because oftentimes we'll see some negative examples and we have to keep reminding ourselves that that's not what the average person is thinking and wanting to be as a salesperson. We all have this ideal vision of the higher self that we want to be in sales. And I think once we give ourselves permission to do that, we have the role models, we can find ourselves, we create a great culture. And I think you've cultivated an amazing audience on this podcast. So it's such a pleasure to be here to share.
Well, I know everyone will be really excited to meet you. I love what you just said. And yet all I can think of in my brain is that I've just called my podcast the wrong name. So for those of you who are eagle-eared listeners, you will know that I called it the Selling To podcast. And that is because I'm currently on my first cup of caffeine for the day. So apologies. It is the Selling to Corporate podcast. We all know that. But just in case you're thinking Jess is losing her marbles, it's not improbable. But I do know the name of the podcast, just in case anyone's wondering. Jason, one of the things that I was really excited about when we started talking was the fact that you had come recommended. This was really interesting for me because it's actually one of my clients, Alison, if you're listening, thank you very much, who recommended that I had a chat with you. I'd put out there, I said, I want to go on some podcasts, talk to some interesting people. Who do you know? Alison proactively emailed me. She didn't comment on the public thread. She proactively emailed me and said, I know this guy who runs this great podcast called Selling with Love, and I think that you would have really interesting conversations. And I was like, oh, okay, great. And off I toddled to your website. And I did that thing, if you're wondering, where I pitched well. And I thought about what Jason's audience might actually want me to talk about. And subsequently had a few conversations about what it looks like to perform best practice sales, really. And I think it's really important that you came from that recommendation, because actually that's how we make a lot of sales. It's how we build a lot of relationships quicker. Would you agree?
Well, I definitely do agree. I also want to call out how when you reached out, because I get tons of people reaching out to be on the show. I think it was with you, we had this conversation about this PR agent that keeps sending us people all the time. They go straight to the spam filter now. I'm sure yours does as well. At least I hope for you. And I'm not going to call out the name, but it was so funny because when I started speaking about it, I think you spelled out the name of this person that just pitches, call it the spaghetti on the wall technique, which we often hear about. Reach out to everyone all the time. And okay, credit to him. At the beginning, I was like, oh, maybe there's an interesting person in this pile. But now there's almost like a feeling of disgust that I'm just like, if the person decided to work with that guy, I don't think it's the type of person I want to bring on my podcast at all. So now it has like a negative brand association, which I think speaks to what you're saying right now is if you're coming from a place of referral, it's a very different energy. And the fact that you took the time to apply, you stood out. It wasn't like you sent me the most in-depth personalized message ever. No, you just said, hey, your podcast seems interesting. I think my topic could be interesting. Should we have a chat? And I was like, hey, it's a human. That's amazing, which is so rare in this space. And it already gives us a clue as to putting the 80-20 rule is the 20% that you do will get you 80% further. And I think we should be grateful for all of the less sophisticated sales initiatives that set a baseline so low that there's no reason we can't be successful if we just start to step up to the plate a little more.
It is exactly that. I was talking about some stats the other day. I always use the Brevet group for sales stats. They have a great compilation. They were talking about the number of salespeople that never follow up even once. Like
Yeah.
48% never follow up once. And I'm just like, what is wrong with you guys? It makes me bang on all the time about, well, if you just did one follow up, you'd be outperforming 48% of professional salespeople. And that's really interesting. The PR example leads us really nicely into where we want to talk to you guys today. I obviously did a very basic but human pitch, and it was interesting. We had a conversation and now we're doing podcasts together. Great. But what we're actually talking about there is implementation. I looked at the opportunity and I was very grateful to Alison for that. And I said, okay, great. I could ignore this and go, I'm not going to go and pitch to be on somebody else's podcast. I could have not done the work. I listened to 3 episodes before I decided if it was going to be a good fit for me. And then I sent a very simple message, which you've all just verified, by the way. So feel free to use that as your podcast template because we get a load of rubbish. And it is that kind of simplicity and first action that actually will move the needle on starting to get results. And I think that a lot of people don't do that because they don't feel confident. And that's your area of specialism, is this self-sabotage piece that really stops people putting a sales process in place.
Mm. You know what's very interesting is that we have some insecurities to go and do sales. Every time people think about the biggest fears they have, public speaking usually ends up being one of the top fears. Not too far from public speaking, sales is really, really close. We're talking about, it's almost like public speaking combined with all money blocks. So now it's like double the intensity of fear. For those who might not have gotten over this fear and this comfort that needs to be built by one person you reach out to and just putting yourself out there, and you have to counteract a lot of the programming that we've gotten growing up. Don't talk to strangers. Children are better seen than heard. You mentioned those follow-up statistics comes from a lot of this language that we use. A funny story I always tell is, a child, are they natural salespeople? And most people are like, yeah, children will sell. Yeah, but they're terrible salespeople because they don't care about who they're selling to. They're not going to be like, well, mom and dad, I did an analysis and the best benefit to getting me a gaming console this year would be to give you more. No, they just go out and they be like, mom, dad, please, 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 can I get it? Can I get it? The story I often say for a child that naturally would just ask follow up all the time because they don't know any better, they're shameless. As a parent, at some point, you got to put your foot down and say, no means no, stop asking. And so when I hear these follow-up statistics, I feel like this is something that still sits in our subconscious programming. Okay, now we're trying to improve, and we would think that all this amazing technology is coming out and making our jobs easier. Oh my God, look, now I can reach 1,000 people, but we haven't even graduated from understanding what is an addition, what is a subtraction, what is a multiplication. And we're given these super powerful scientific calculators that oftentimes the result is you just freeze. And now you don't know what is the first action to take because every action you take could be reaching thousands of people. And it seems so intimidating because we haven't even done the work that we need to do to feel just confident, which needs to be built by having competence first. So now all these tools were supposed to be the holy grail to help a lot of salespeople have paralyzed a lot and enabled a few terrible ones.
Oh, 100%. And I think it's always so interesting when we look at the kind of piece you mentioned there around reaching thousands of people. I remember that being terrifying when I was selling B2C because I was, oh God, if I've got 5,000 Instagram followers, which somehow I still have. So thanks if you follow me on Instagram. I'm apologizing that I don't post anything interesting other than my various shenanigan stories. It was a concern that 5,000 people at a time would see something, or I'd post an email to my list and I'd have 12,000 people reading an email and judging immediately on whether I'd said something right or whether I'd said something they didn't like. For me, that's what makes B2B sales such a great area to be in, because you are building those relationships one at a time. If you want to, you can use that technology once you've perfected your system to send out 50, 100, 1,000. But if you're not confident yet, you've got the ability to go, yeah, no, screw it. I'm just going to do 1. And then tomorrow I'll do 2. And you can almost compound interest on your sales activity as you develop your confidence. And I think that's huge. It sounds very basic and foundational. And I think people worry that they won't get results as quickly. But actually, with what you're saying is if they build their own confidence and they start taking the activity that they should be, they're going to see those results, and they're probably going to see them quicker than they would have if they'd sat paralyzed looking at Facebook for 3 days wondering, should I make this post or not, right?
Yeah, you're totally right. And It's very interesting because one of the things that will go in parallel with building your confidence, which is just from doing actions and repeating and realizing it's not so bad. The other thing is if you're going to be using tools to automate, it's going to be automating and scaling the level of competence that you're at. And
Mm,
one of the biggest things you probably want to improve on before you go and automate and scale things is how much do you understand the customers you're going to be speaking to? In my book, I speak about, loving the client as one of the loves in selling. And no, I'm not advocating for any kind of relationship from a romantic standpoint. What I am using it as an analogy is caring enough to understand. And the best way to understand is start slow, have conversations, get a better understanding, refine. And then you get to start at a point where, oh my God, this target market that I'm actually looking to help, that I'm bringing solutions to, I'm starting to understand what are their common pain points. I get to understand a bit of what are the things they're seeking, whether you're speaking to some procurement person, an HR person, depending on what is your business strategy. In B2C, you start realizing what's important to who are major players in making the deal go through. And
mm.
that comes from very small steps from here. I would borrow something that you've said in our last conversation, which is I love the aspect of B2B that you highlighted, which is every conversation becomes an asset. It's an extra node that can lead to a referral, to a connection, as opposed to B2C, where every lead is like, all right, have we monetized on it? No, then put it in a back burner to possibly monetize in the future. It's a much more burn and churn kind
Yeah,
of vibe. And I
that's
think
really
B2B is so much more about that nurturing and starting slow and understanding.
But that's really interesting because I speak to quite a lot of people about this kind of thing, and they always see B2C as being the more relationship driven of the two. But I love what you've just said there about, okay, well, unfortunately, it has that natural transactional nature because if that lead doesn't pan out, you have to find something else to replace it with. So it's like a ticking time bomb, essentially, of when is it going to pan out? And if it doesn't, at what point do we have to forego the relationship with that person
Yeah.
and replace them with someone else?
It's really interesting too because you have to have so many conversations. And in the B2C, there's a lot of these people that will want to have a conversation that might not be the most qualified leads neither. So you have to start setting up filters because, again, the average value for each of those connections isn't going to be the same as in a B2B space. So you have to set up boundaries. You need to protect your energy. My book speaks a lot about the transaction. I actually label sales as an energy exchange, and I don't mention this in the book, but I do want to highlight that every time you're doing sales doesn't lead to a sale, speaking to an unqualified lead, repeat, rinse, repeat. And there's a point that, especially in B2C, that you get a lot of rejections in a row or unqualified leads and calls, and then you are drained because these
Yeah.
people will take your energy. When you see that there's an unqualified lead is not necessarily going to lead to as much business, you have to manage your time.
Mm.
In the contrary, when you're in your B2B space, you're building pillars that are all going to connect into a web. So then each of these relationships becomes so much more fulfilling because it can lead to something better.
100%. And I think it's so interesting because what we don't realize, and I can't remember who said this, so you guys will have to go and Google if you want the actual quote. I'm going to paraphrase badly, but there was somebody who said, you can only have a certain number of relationships at a time. And there was a scientific study that looked at people who were the happiest. And basically, it said most people can only manage relationships with up to 10 people at one time to keep track of. And then you get the real unicorns out there. And I don't know whether it's related to introversion or extroversion. I would imagine that there's some link, but I definitely haven't dug into it enough, where those unicorns essentially can manage 100 relationships at a time. And they're good at that. And I think social media sets us up, and social media selling and B2C sales in general sets us up to believe that we should be one of these unicorns who can manage 100 relationships, 200 relationships, because of our focus on proactive content that we're pushing out all the time for them to consume. B2B is different. It plays to the generic skill that we all have. We can all manage, allegedly, 10 relationships. So we can all do that. And if you manage 10 B2B relationships, actually out of that, you're statistically likely to get 2 sales as a minimum. If you manage 1,000 B2C relationships, because the conversion rate is 1 to 2%, you're still likely to get 1 or 2 sales. But you've had to build proactively all of those relationships and maintain them. And that is a lot of work.
Mhm. what I find interesting is most people will look at B2B,
Mm,
and myself included, where I'm like, wow, I think it requires a lot more work. And
mhm,
so you kind of default to the simplicity that a B2C sale can look like. But
mm.
once you start putting it in perspective, like you just did there, you start realizing how much more work it is to go into B2C space. Another thing to keep in mind is if you want to be effective at sales, the way I define the concept of selling with love is when you know what you offer is so much more than what you ask in return. The best way to know how much you're going to be offering value is to find a certain way to quantify it, to
Mm.
quantify the value of the problems you're solving. At a B2C level, oftentimes it's a lot more subjective, it's a lot more fluffy. And so you have to really turn up your skills in copywriting, in persuasion tactics, in influence triggers, all of those things to make somebody understand the value. We talk about future pacing, results in advance. There's a whole lot of psychology. So I would definitely say that on the B2C side, there's a lot more direct response marketing and sales methodology
Yeah.
that is far more advanced than what I've mostly seen in the B2B space. You can look at the B2C space and realize there's some magical things you can do to improve your results.
Mm,
But what you have to understand at its core is the reason you're doing that and wanting to use these methods is because you ultimately know that what you offer is more than what you ask in return. And
mm.
so the techniques you use for people to understand that value are going to be not manipulation, they're going to be empathy. They're
Yeah.
going to be you speaking a language that's necessary for people to understand that you actually care. And as a caveat, in a B2B space, much easier to quantify the exact value.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And let's just dig into that because I think it's so interesting what you've said there about the direct response marketing. 'Cause some of the things that we talk about when we talk about direct response marketing or when we talk about B2C sales that you've brought up around influence triggers and persuasion, essentially an NLP, if you've used
Yep.
NLP for sales, essentially some of this does come down to feeling like you are manipulating people. You're manipulating their natural responses to things. I think that the worst impression and probably the first impression that most people have of selling, they think that they are being manipulated or forced to buy something. And actually, that's not something that you or I teach. And your framework, the core principles or the guiding principles that you have around sales are specifically avoiding those things because that's not something you believe, it's not something I believe. So, can you talk a little bit about the idea of selling with integrity? Because that's a big piece for you. And it's something we don't often see in the
Yeah.
kind of generic online marketing space.
Yeah. For me, what I think is very interesting is having some sort of litmus test to know if you've crossed the boundary or not. One thing I would add is to me, when I hear about things like you can run webinars and convert multiple peoples, you can have them go through an application process, and then you can have scripts that can help you sell, and then you can have these books. All of those I think are great tools. I
Mm,
am very much an advocate to finding ways to be more efficient as a salesperson so that you can go and serve more people more effectively, make a greater impact as a return. But again, you have to understand where do I draw the line? And I think that's where a lot of people might struggle because you've probably witnessed things that you're like, that was maybe a little iffy. I'll give you a clear example that'll make it pretty clear. But if I was selling a program and I say, listen, if you join this program, cost $10,000 and by the next 3 months you'll end up making 100,000 guaranteed or I'll give you $20,000 back after 3 months.
mm.
That's a pretty bold
Strong.
offer. Sounds pretty strong. So you end up buying 3 months passes, you don't make 100,000, I don't refund you anything. And I can tell you, oh, by the way, that's just a promise I make to get you to buy, but we don't refund anybody because we don't care. You'd be like, what the hell? That's scammy. That's douchey. That's not right. The litmus test is actually quite simple. By the end of the transaction, can you share with the person you sold to what methods you use to get them to actually purchase confidently and
Yeah.
have them not be repulsed in the process?
I love that.
It's
I
so simple.
really like that.
If instead I would actually work with someone and say, again, I make an offer, I say, listen, work with me for $10,000 and within 3
Mm,
months, you're going to make 100,000. If not, we'll pay you back 20,000.
yeah.
By the end of the 3 months, you don't make your money and I refund you the 20,000 and they're like, "Well, how does this work?" We say, "Listen, we've worked this process with hundreds of people and we know there's a certain percentage of people that succeed, a certain percentage that don't, but we're able to make more sales by making you this promise and we still are more profitable giving you the double money back. You're still an advocate. You probably will tell more friends to come and try it out. You've moved the needle forward, and this is part of our core business model. I have an example actually that is a real example, and it's from a company I worked for quite a long time, personal growth industry called Mind Valley.
Ah,
They did this thing that's really genius. They sold a product which was about setting goals for your life. It was called Lifebook.
mm,
And they said you can buy the program for $500. And when you finish the program, you can get your money back. And
nice.
that got people buying like crazy because they said, for once, we want to reward the people that'll actually do the work. And
Mm,
by the end of the program, when you were eligible for a refund, they said you can get your refund or you can join a program for an extra dollar where you'll be part of a membership. And looking at the refund statistics, to
mm,
the upsell statistics, to the non-completion statistics, it was such a profitable launch above and beyond any other launch. And
mm.
we told people openly, a lot of people just didn't ask for the refund because they got so much value. What an exciting offer that even when we share to people what was done, they're like, I love it. It got me to set my goals.
Yeah.
So creating creative offers like this that are not about manipulating, but are empathetic because we don't want to change.
Mm.
Like status quo is a strong energy. So how do we make sales techniques that allows us to do that first step is actually really powerful. And if you can share it with the people after you've made the sale saying, yeah, by the way, that webinar educated you and converted you on the sales calls. I ask you these questions so I can qualify you and really get you excited. But look, now you've made a purchase and a transformation happen. The person will probably say thank you.
I love that. I really, really do love that. And for any of you who are, because I know that we have lots of people who are navigating the B2B and B2C fence and doing both, that is a really, really good way of understanding, okay, am I selling in a way that works for me or am I not? And it's so funny because as you were saying it, I think of all of the corporate clients that we've ever worked with who go, well, can you tell us how your sales training is good? And can you show us that it works? And I'm like, are we on this call? Have you bought? Like, and it's so funny. And then they sit there and you can see their faces. They're like, oh yeah. And I go, and you remember our lead generation worked because we sent you this. And then when you didn't reply a million times, we sent you that. And they go, oh wow. And I go, okay, did you feel like we were sleazy at any point? They're like, no. And I'm like, okay, well, there you are. And it's the perfect way of distilling it. I really, really like that. Really
Yep.
like that. Which
Yep.
obviously
So
validates you. You know it's good, but like for everybody else, I really like that.
yeah, and it's such a simple trick. In the book, I call it the magician with a rabbit test because
Mm.
I say, like, imagine the magician's on stage, pulls a rabbit out of the hat. Everyone's like, wow. And then he's like, do you know how I do this? And they're like, what? They're like, oh, I put the rabbit back. It disappears because I murder the rabbit. People will be like, oh my God, why would you do that? That's horrible. So you need to show them the magic trick, and nobody needs to be killing rabbits here.
Yeah, that is a key component. Nobody needs to murder any small animals in the course
Fact.
of the podcast episode.
Strong
Wow.
fact.
I really like that. It is one of those things. Integrity is such a buzzword in the online space, and it has been for a very long time. I think people are so afraid of doing things out of integrity that they actually come across as being more sleazy than they initially expect. We probably see that the podcast example from earlier is a good indicator of that. The person sending all those emails probably doesn't know that we go, oh, they're spammy and gross. And there are simple reasons as to why they're spammy and gross. They don't think about our podcasts in any of them. They don't talk about what our audience could potentially learn in any of them. They only exist to pitch or hard sell their client as a podcast guest, which is fine. It's spaghetti at the wall, like you mentioned. There will be some numbers or some podcast hosts who go, oh, well, I've got no content for next week. Sure, why not? And it will work. The downside of it, though, is that it's completely uncontrollable. It could be a lack of confidence that's produced that result of, okay, well, people talk about sales being scammy or gross when they don't have relationships built with them. And essentially, it's become like the Facebook message selling that we've become so used to. You know, every time it's my birthday, someone will say, happy birthday, Jess. By the way, do you want to try Juice Plus? Right? Or whatever other thing is going on. And I don't take offense at that. And that's just because I have skin like rhino hide. But I don't sit there and go, oh, wow, everyone must think I've piled on weight over the last year. I should definitely go on a diet. I think, oh, wow, that person is so underconfident and undercompetent with sales that the only way they know how to reach out and approach me is to spam message me on my birthday with their offer, because they think in their mind, of course, that's the best time for me to look at my messages and respond to them. It's exactly what we're talking about with this self-sabotage piece. Sometimes in our quest to be non-salesy, we actually do the wrong things that put people off. And it's not through a case of not wanting to be in integrity. It's because we haven't run that litmus test.
Well, there's a few things to unpack in there. One of them is that again, this is so great that we have that podcast spammer example because it puts it so concrete. They keep doing it because there's some level of success to it, right? And one thing that's very interesting, especially with the fact that my book is all about selling with love, but the final chapter is actually the real point of the book, which is actually about buying with love. Because the market will respond to our behaviors as buyers. I give the example, no matter where you stand on this issue, there's a lot of people that are very concerned about environmental issues caused by meat consumption. Controversial, I know, but if those are your beliefs, then your purchase decisions actually will influence what the market offers.
Yeah.
And so the same way, if we're podcast hosts and we're like, we don't want to see that behavior among salespeople, then you shouldn't be buying from the people that are having those behaviors. I've had some very successful people that I've interviewed on my podcast, and I've done a bit more due diligence and realized that I didn't want to release the episode. And these are very big players that everyone would instantly recognize. And I bit my nails and I was like, is this what I want to see more in the world or less? And so I think for every decision we make as buyers influence what people will do as sellers. So that's number one. Number two is there's a lot of people that will share sales methods that will encourage people at the beginning stages to try techniques that they don't know any better, so they will use them. That's where there's a bit of a gap because it's not their fault. For a friend that's reaching out, definitely their upline told them like, yeah, do that on their birthday. This was part of their core sales training and they're doing their best. They're trying to figure out. I think as salespeople ourselves, we have to give that feedback. We have to be there and being like, hey, you only reach out. It doesn't come across really cool when you do that. Like they are not getting the feedback. So we have a bit of a responsibility then. We don't want to be mean and et cetera. So yeah, we're partly responsible as well. We have to look at examples that are raising the bar. And just like we were saying at the beginning, it's great we found each other. In my quest of writing my book, it's funny because I found so many amazing people in this industry that have written books that are of a similar nature. There was like Larry Levine called Selling with the Heart. There was Sarah McCrum, which was about fall in love with money. There was so many authors and authorities that are changing the way to perceive sales to be done with a way that most of us intuitively would understand is the way to be successful, which is how do you care for people? How do you communicate like they're human? And then how do you find ways to still be efficient with your time and being as personalized as possible? And I think that is something that technology is enabling us, but there's that fine line we got to run. We have to run a litmus test on our own sales activity and realize, is this how we would want to communicate? Would that make somebody happy that we did that or not? We have to ask the question.
I really love that. And I think, my biggest takeaway certainly from this episode is if we're doing the things that we would be happy for people to publicly know about our sales process, then we should be happy with our sales process. And that ties into a lot of the things that we've discussed on the podcast before around there are multiple personality types of entrepreneurs. There are multiple personality types of people who will end up having to be in sales. No matter what your personality type is, you are going to have to find the actions that make you happy to go ahead and make the commitment of doing sales activity every day and doing lead generation activity every day. And so if you are being told to do something that doesn't feel like a good fit for you, or that you think, oh, would somebody feel like they were being scammed, or would somebody feel like they were being attacked by my sales methods, then actually that's not going to be the right method for you. And rather than try and fit yourself into that box, it's better to think, okay, what can I do instead? How can I adjust this? Or how can I find somebody who can help me adjust that method? Thank you so much for coming on the show today. Honestly, it's been amazing. Despite me forgetting the name of the podcast in the beginning, we made it through like pros.
Yes, we did. And it was amazing. No, it's such a joy to have a conversation with you about this. And I think for the fact that there's such an audience, a demand, for those of you who are listening, you are the heroes that we need in sales. And so I'm so excited that your platform is advocating the kinds of message that we need to promote because great salespeople have always been doing this. We just need more people to understand that it is okay, it is the way, and there's so much potential that we can do while we all start to play this way.
I love it. Where can people find you? I know that you've mentioned your book, but I don't feel like we've adequately promoted that. So Jason does have a book and he also has a podcast. Are those the best places for people to find you? And if so, where are the key links?
For anybody who looks for selling with love, you will find so much that I offer, including the podcast itself. My book's available, Audible, ebook, all that good stuff. But my favorite thing I love doing with everyone, Jessica, again, we talk about personalization. If you've enjoyed something, you had a takeaway from this, come to LinkedIn, Jason Marc Campbell, connect with me and add a note. Add a note and tell me. I love it when people do that. They just say, I heard you on this podcast and I took away this. Come and say hi. That's the best way to connect. I'm hoping I got a chance to support a lot of great salespeople in the process. So
Good. We love that. And I will make sure that the links for the book and the podcast are in the show notes. So it's easily accessible for you guys who I know will want to go away and grab those. And we always say on the podcast, please do go and connect with people on LinkedIn and let them know what your key breakthroughs are. Recording any episode like this, it takes time out of somebody's day. I know that when I'm a guest on other shows or that when I have people on here, you guys are really great at going and finding that person saying, this was my key breakthrough moment listening to you. So I'm expecting, Jason, that you'll get about 1,000 messages of, hey, I love the litmus test. And I'm going to do that now with everything.
tell me if you passed the test.
Yeah, no, I love that. It's like a little quiz and survey all in one. Thank you so much. That's been an amazing episode. And for you guys listening, please do make sure that you head over onto LinkedIn. Let Jason know about any breakthroughs that you've had during this episode. And we'll see you in the next one.